Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, that little piece of odd that surpasses all understanding. And there's a reference for you. Well, welcome to another episode of Musical Talk, where we're going to be looking at the 2023 Edinburgh Festival Fringe, the biggest arts festival in the world, and one of the places where you can see the widest selection of musical theatre in the world whilst it's on. Now, last week, if you've waded through the bumper episode coming in at about 2 hours, you will, I hope, have had a sense of that festival from the prism of those of us who love musical theatre. And you would have heard clips of interviews that I recorded whilst I was up at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe with the people behind the various productions which I most loved. You'll have heard some songs and you'll have heard some atmosphere. As I said last week, that's really a tasting menu, a sense of what it was like this year. But in this week's episode, and indeed for the next few weeks, we're going to be reviewing and talking about some of those shows. And I shall be joined by a number of people who I count both as friends and as colleagues here at Musical Talk. In a future episode, you'll hear me talking to Colin Malloy, who was at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe for much of the time I was there, and we'll be talking about the shows that we saw which tickled our fancy. But this week, we're going to be talking with another old friend of Musical Talk, fellow presenter Josh Clark. And Josh is no stranger to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. He was there again this year, and he's been there in so many different capacities in the past. He's been a performer, he's been in an orchestra, he's been there in an official reviewing capacity, and of course he's been there as just a punter. And today we're going to hear a conversation that I had with Josh, which we recorded on Josh's last day at the Fringe this year, so very, very fresh, this recording, where we discussed two shows which he had seen, but which, at the time of recording, I had not. And those two shows were Thos and Stella Solve a Murder and Hello Kitty Must Die. Now, Thos and Stella Solve a Murder needs almost no introduction because in 2022 it was the Musical Talk pick of the Fringe. It was a fabulous musical last year, and it's returned again this year in a slightly expanded version, which I got to see after I recorded this conversation with Josh Clark. And I'm pleased to say it's still a 5-star show, and it really is a masterpiece in its own way. I would be stunned if it wasn't going to go on tour at some stage, and it would be deservingly found in the West End if anyone wants to take it there. But Hello Kitty Must Die is a piece that I didn't know. I only knew of it briefly by reputation, in the sense that the people behind Six, which is a musical of which you will have heard, have been involved in the production of it. So, what are we going to get today? Well, in just a minute, you'll hear that conversation that I had with Josh and his friend Josh. I know it's confusing, isn't it? About those two shows. But to take us into that, let's hear the official blurbs for those shows from the EdFringe website. For Hello Kitty Must Die, the description online is, "You may think Fiona Yu is just another Hello Kitty stereotype, but you'd be dead wrong. From the Tony-winning producer of Six comes an outrageously irreverent world premiere musical mashup of Asian feminism with a killer score. Fiona Yu is a high-achieving but highly disillusioned Chinese-American woman. She's fed up with the stereotypes forced onto her by a white patriarchal society, namely that she is the human embodiment of a speechless cartoon feline. Based on the cult novel by Angela S. Choi, this musical is a ruthless combination of sex, violence, and stilettos." And, as you'll hear in the conversation with the two Joshes shortly, they'll be picking up on many of the themes which have been identified in that blurb. But that comes chronologically after our conversation about the wonderful 5-star Thos and Stella Solve a Murder. Now, I hope that you'll remember it from last year, but let's hear the blurb from this year's EdFringe website about this. Best friends forever, Thos and Stella are Hull's least successful true crime podcasters. When their favourite author is killed, they are thrust into a thrilling whodunit of their own. Can they crack the case and become global podcast superstars before the killer strikes again? The hilarious musical from the Olivia Award winners behind Fleabag, Baby Reindeer and A Super Happy Story returns. Written by John Britton and Matthew Floyd Jones, The Guardian called it a thrilling foray into silliness, and the Financial Times, in an unexpectedly blunt statement, called it bloody marvellous. And who am I to disagree with that? So that's Hello Kitty Must Die and Kathy and Stella Solve a Murder. And let's hear more about them now from Josh Clark and Josh Beavis. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Well, I have to say that it's a great pleasure for me this morning to be able to say that here in Edinburgh I am awash with Josh, by which I mean I have two Joshes at my disposal. My very good friend and a friend of Musical Talk, Josh Clark, who I met here in Edinburgh many, many years ago, where you were living the dream by playing W.S. Gilbert and playing W.S. Gilbert so very well.
I believe this is the 10-year anniversary, in fact.
Oh, is it? Congratulations. Oh, well, in which case, let's write a libretto and put on an operetta.
We should, we must.
But with you today, Josh, we have, as people will have gathered, a second Josh, Josh Beavis.
Yes.
And you're no stranger to enjoying theatre more than perhaps just as a punter, because you've studied theatre and indeed film in your university career, is that correct?
I did, yes.
So, if I may say, I feel I'm in the best possible company to be talking about a few musicals which are up here at Edinburgh. Gentlemen, it's jolly good to see you, so thank you very much for joining me. And Josh and I will have a particular resonance because we're meeting in the Pleasance Dome, where we've met at an unearthly hour in the morning on many an occasion to do precisely this.
Indeed. Good to be back here and to have one of our cherished Edinburgh episodes.
I like you. Reviewing before we start. Let's start with an absolutely top-notch show, and it's a show that I saw last year, and I know that you two have seen this year, and it's Kathy and Stella Solve a Murder. Now, I saw the slightly shortened version last year because it was premiering here last year. Matthew Floyd Jones is the composer, and last year he was playing the piano, and I had the pleasure of interviewing him, and it was our pick of the Fringe. I'm really delighted to see it's back again this year in a slightly expanded version, a 90-minute version, I think. But first, I'd just like to ask you your opinions, your thoughts, and your hot takes.
Oh, hot takes. I'm not sure I'm best placed for that sort of thing, but it was very good. Really very good. I remember we had spoken, in the weeks before the Fringe started this year, and you mentioned that this was a good one to have chosen. I think when I was looking at the listings, I kind of chose it independently, but then you supported the idea of going to see it.
I'm pleased we're on the same resonance.
Absolutely, and it was a great way to finish the first day, because we had a very long drive up and just a few shows that evening, and went to see this one, and it was absolutely superb in the Udderbelly, so one of the larger venues as well, which is normally a good sign at Edinburgh, isn't it?
If it's expanded up into a bigger venue.
Yes.
Oh yes.
Yeah, you tend to avoid the lesser shows by going to a big one often.
Enthusiastic but less polished offers sometimes, yes.
Indeed.
Well, let's be honest, it's one of the bigger venues and therefore presumably costs a little bit more, and therefore you have to be able to put your money where your mouth is.
Oh, definitely, and you can tell that, this isn't one of the student shows or one that's just in its infancy. It's quite a well-developed piece now, isn't it? And
is it Francesca Moody as a producer, I think? It's got a proper production house.
I recall seeing the name, and it sounded like when you saw it there was just the composer on the piano, was there?
Yes, that's right.
Well, we had an expanded band this time, two keyboards, drums and guitar.
Ooh, so a wider soundscape. I mean, that's going to be very interesting. Once again, you're whetting my appetite for my return to this. So, briefly, without giving anything away, in case people haven't heard our previous episode talking about it, how would you describe it?
Well, it plays into the current fashion for, ironically, podcasts.
What are these?
I know, my goodness, I see people doing them. And it's, the fashion at the moment is just for anyone to be able to speak about whatever niche interest that they have. But in fact, more than that, the proliferation of true crime podcasts.
Yes, the world of podcasts has become genred. I think that's very clear, and that is an absolute. It's like in the library. There's a big section dedicated to true crime. Remember that? True crime, and so it is with podcasts.
Indeed, and so you've got these two leading characters, Kathy and Stella, funnily enough, who, let's say, are outsiders, misfits in one way or another,
Yeah.
but what brings those two together is their shared passion for murder. Studying it, reading about it.
Homicide in Young Lace. That's right,
Indeed, yes. Well, that's a reference, yeah, very good. They, as the title suggests, take their interest one step further, hear about a murder that has taken place, and feel as though they can make a bigger name for themselves, raise their podcast out of just general obscurity by solving this murder.
But of course, the subtext there, isn't it, that this will have an effect on their relationship one way or the other, and so that they're on a personal journey as well as trying to solve the murder. It's one of those, because it's good enough to have plots and subplots and a journey. So I mean, it's a beautifully crafted piece. Josh, what did you make of it?
Yeah, I thought it was very enjoyable. Don't know if you talk about this sort of thing, but we didn't pay full price, but it's the sort of thing I would happily have paid more for.
Well, you mean it's got an Edinburgh price, hasn't it? Whereas if you saw it in the West End, it would be considerably inflated.
Yeah, I think with hindsight, I would happily, I wouldn't worry to pay a bit more for it. Yeah, I thought it was fantastic. I think one of the best things best compliments I can say is after 20 minutes or so, I just let it wash over me.
In the sense you stopped analysing it as a kind of critical kind of way and just enjoyed it for what it was.
Yes, when I come to the Fringe, you've got your sort of hat on and you're thinking, well, what star would I give this? But yeah, after 20 minutes, half an hour, I forgot all that and I was just absorbed by the narrative and the two leads. I think you also pointed out as well, it's 90 minutes, but it flies by in the good sense. I thought it was fantastic.
Yes, it's not. There's Edinburgh Time concertinas in lots of different ways. You don't know what day it is at any stage during anyone's stay in Edinburgh. And then secondly, some shows which are half an hour feel like 4 days, and some shows which are an hour and a half seem to fly through in what you might think is 20 minutes, half an hour.
Yeah.
I think I would agree with what Josh was saying, because you see so many things here of all different qualities that sometimes you find yourself in the first 5 or 10 minutes of a show a little bit on edge before you can settle into it.
Indeed.
But very quickly here you relax.
It almost doesn't have to prove anything, does it? This one. Now, when I went in to see it last year, Matthew was sitting at the keyboard and already playing. He was improvising an overture, I seem to remember. Because he was the composer, he knew it. And he's also able to extemporise it in accordance with the time it took for the auditorium to fill last year, which was at Summer Hall. Different venue. It was in one of the marquees, one of the circular marquees, so it was all in the round. How did the music start? Was it playing as you came in?
Yes.
It was playing a few tracks that well known. Like, they weren't doing any. They were sort of warming up and whatnot.
Fine. So you weren't all. The performance wasn't sort of already in play when you began.
No, the band members were there at the instruments at the front, but it was a recorded soundtrack, wasn't it, over the top?
Songs
just
around.
and
they were. You could see, they were just fiddling and tweaking.
Well, fiddling may be part of the job, to be honest.
But I do believe, I didn't get a programme or cast list or anything, but I think the composer you're speaking of
Matthew Floyd Jones.
Matthew Floyd Jones was probably the lead keyboard there.
Was he blonde?
Yes.
That sounds like
he was. I could see he was one.
He was definitely conducting it.
If it is him, well, even if it isn't him, Matthew Floyd Jones has music in his fingertips.
I was say, you look very young.
I'll let him know.
Well, no, if you're saying, he can. He not produced it. Sorry,
he's the composer.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I was shocked. He looks very young.
But he's got a lot of theatre behind him. He was part of he is still part of a double act called Frisky and Mannish. They don't do much at the moment, but he's been treading the boards for a while.
It was just
with his own material as well. Sorry.
Okay.
That's interesting, I think.
Yeah, Josh just alluded to how he was conducting this, so we sometimes get.
Well, this is your absolute speciality, if I may say, Josh.
I know
you've got an eye for this. One eye always goes sideways and looks at the orchestra.
That's it. You know what I'm like now. But it was an interesting way of doing it, because all four of them were at the very back of the stage and facing the audience.
Yep.
Okay, so they couldn't really crane their necks around to be looking at the conductor the whole time, and plus he was a piano conductor, so you haven't got
his fingers are available,
exactly,
but not often.
And there's different ways of doing it, aren't there? We've talked about shoulder conducting and nods and that sort of thing, but they were all wearing headsets, and he was kind of just whispering the counts at the starts of songs, so you don't have to bring your baton up or bring your hand up to signify the first beat. It was just kind of 4-1. That didn't sound very good over the 3-4-1, just quietly into his headset, and they were all therefore on the beat.
So they were radio connected, that's
radio
the point.
Okay.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because that simply wouldn't have been available even 20 years ago, really. You wouldn't have connected your orchestra members up that way.
No,
it would all be visual.
Quite an unusual thing to do, really. But it worked very well.
That's interesting. Well, let's talk about the music then. I mean, first of all, the quality of the band. I mean, because it's a big venue to fill. Because obviously, as I say, we were in the round in a tent, so actually one man on the keyboard was plenty in work.
Yes.
And of course, it was all amped as well. So they got their levels right.
So this falls into the category of things like Be More Chill that we've spoken about before, where you have the main keys playing main key part, right, keyboard one part, got the drums, got the guitar / bass, but then there's the second keyboard, which was fleshing out an awful lot. So it was, for a lot of the time, kind of different patches and effects rather than second keyboard part. I think we mentioned...
So keyboard was computer almost?
Yes. So I remember when we spoke about Be More Chill back along, that was changing the sound of the music, the style and the tone, and also the voice of the keyboard 10 times within a song, and that was what this second keyboard part was doing, at least for part of the show. But that massively, therefore, does pad out the sound, because it isn't just two keyboards.
No, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because it creates a scape which is beyond just instruments. It's the instrumentation now is more than instruments somehow. I suppose the closest mechanical avatar would be a church organ. You can pull out all the stops, literally. And therefore, presumably, this is not dissimilar to that. But how did that work? I mean, obviously, was it able to fill the space? I'm guessing, by the way, it's not a proscenium arch, but it was in front, and you were in rows, serried rows in front of it, theatre style? Or?
Yeah, it was thrust, really. You had audience stage left and stage right as well. Yeah, we were at the front, but it looked designed mostly for proscenium.
Which is, I suspect, where it's ultimately going to go, because if you're heading towards London, most of the venues there are that way, probably.
Yes, and, getting to the casting, that would reflect the ambition here of the show. I don't know if it was a different cast from when you saw it last year. I would suspect.
If Kathy and Stella are the actors who are on the posters, then it's the same cast.
Okay. All right, so, one of the two leads, Kathy, I think, was played by Bronte Barbe, who we saw together, Thos, didn't we?
We did.
Relatively recently in Newsies in Wembley. Yeah. And...
So she's already a name to conjure with, she's appearing in big buck shows.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Very...
Or Disney, as we also call them.
Yeah. No, she's doing really well as a leading lady, and having a very good career. I didn't clock until the end that it was her, in fact.
That's an amazing testament to her versatility,
Yes, like transformation.
Yeah. And there's no reason why she wouldn't have that. She's obviously a professional actor. But it is wonderful that you and I have seen her so recently, and actually it took you a while to clock.
And perfect for the role. I mean, the two of them together absolutely carry it. Vocally flawless, acting superb.
Chemistry. Because individually you can have actresses that do what you're describing, but you put them together and it doesn't click. But they, it feels like they genuinely have been doing a podcast forever, and they grew up together.
That's true.
And they immersed themselves in their characters. I remember that last year. Absolutely. You felt that you knew these people, and that these people weren't stage creations. That I know this Kathy, and I know this, or I know a Kathy, and I know a Stella.
Yeah.
They're chalk and cheese as well as
they're
characters,
very
aren't they?
big roles too.
Well, they're on all the time, more or less.
They're on all the time and singing throughout, and quite big songs a lot of the time as well. They were kept busy for the 90 minutes.
If I didn't have you, I would die.
Yeah.
Yes.
That is one of the songs. I'm not declaring my my lifelong devotion. But that's quite a full-on ballad, isn't it? I mean, it's also not a love song per se. It's a song of devotion, a song of affection, and a song of friendship. I mean, that's another thing about this. There are suggestions, aren't there? I mean, they've got a podcast heckler who suggests they're both lesbian. But their relationship is quite an interesting one. How would you describe it? Because actually, to me, it's a musical about friendship.
Right, and we were having this discussion afterwards, weren't we? Kind of saying, well, what is the message behind this? Because the plot is pretty madcap, really.
Oh, yes.
But it works absolutely fine because it is played big enough for that to be kind of plausible. But you're right, you dig underneath that, and we kind of come back to the start of the conversation where it is two misfit characters who find their voice through this interest. And
literally, in fact, because it's a podcast.
Absolutely,
it's quite obvious.
And they're doing very well, but we very quickly do still see their insecurities, and we get glimpses into each of their respective home lives and almost the problems that they're using their time in their garage talking to each other in kind of a different world entirely to get away from.
It's their oasis, isn't it?
That's it. Yeah. And so there is, I suppose, on some level, a comment on the nature of what people are doing with the podcast movement and how it is a kind of therapeutic. And when we were talking, Josh, I saw it in terms of community actually as well. And if you are someone who is on the outsides of the society that you're born into, you've now got, through the airwaves, a new almost family and community. That's it. And they talk about, well, we get emails and we see the comments, and they are part of a radio family, really.
And you talk about subplots as well, like a community, and we were saying about like why it's set in Hull as well. So it's that these two women or young girls who might be disenfranchised, and they have to find their little niche. And we said it's interesting that it's set in like that part. It's almost like the geography is like a minor character as well.
That's a good point.
Yes, and that's not just a point about the north of England, but it's referenced in the play when one of them is going to go off to university to Manchester, and to the other that feels like, what? What, you're leaving here?
It's the end of the earth, isn't
exactly,
it?
Yeah. So there is that almost sitcom trope of being trapped.
That makes yes, two oddballs in a trapped situation is a very...
And that's where the drama can come as well, because everything is intensified because it's this and there's nowhere else to go.
But it is ultimately social podcasting. I mean, forgive me, Josh, I'm going to say this, you and I would not have met probably if it weren't for this podcast. And I count you amongst my friends, so I hope you won't mind me saying that. But
likewise.
Oh, it's lovely. Well, goodbye, everyone. But seriously, it's and you see that in their situation. But the journey they go on, they're friends at the beginning. Obviously, their friendship is tested, and then it resolves in the way it resolves. What do you draw of the journey that they're on? Because they start as friends, so actually, where is this going? Is their friendship just merely getting stronger? Because it's quite a bold tale to be telling for just people who become more friends.
It's almost like a story of growing up, because the way that they're viewed by society, because they are 30, aren't they?
Yes,
actually that number comes up quite often. So it's almost like they're saying there's like a turning point, and you should have everything figured out by 30, and these two don't. So it's almost
maybe one of the writers has just reached that stage. Who knows?
So yeah, it's like you say, the journey is they sort of step, and the fact that one of them is in her pajamas all the time and sort of is an infant. Well, they both are as a pair, and they I think that's it. Their relationship's tested, and it resolves how it resolves. But yeah, I think it's a story of growing up.
Self-discovery, would you argue?
Yeah.
And individualism within community as well. And that, all of the people listening to the podcast and producing it are there for this one very specific interest which keeps them all together. But there is a pretty clear message, almost said out loud, that we are not the same person, though. We have this shared interest, but we are still our own people, and that is kind of the fracture in the relationship for a while, because I'm still going to do the podcast, but I need to have my own life as well. And the other says, well, no, you're nothing without me, or we're nothing without each other, more accurately. So it is an exploration of what it means to have the shared interest and be friends, I suppose.
But that's really interesting, isn't it? That concept of actually, does a friendship become closer when people actually can find a way of moving apart, or an element of their life moving apart? I mean, that's the dichotomy, isn't it? It's quite interesting. You're quite right. The threat, as one person sees it, to the other one disappearing from their lives, whilst the other one saying, no, I'm not going to disappear from my life, but I've got to have this extra element.
And even before that, in fact, the relationship is tested through betrayal of a sort. Because,
indeed, yes, quite. An impulsive action.
They've both agreed that they're going to try to solve the murder, but are doing it with the best of intentions-ish. And one of the pair, though, starts to doctor some of the evidence or put out stuff on the podcast that isn't fully true, and has done it without consulting the other. So there's this artistic split which starts everything. And even within that, you see the individuality of the pair, because one of them has slightly stronger ambition where they want to take things than the other.
Well, it represents the difference in temperament, I think, doesn't it? Because they're very temperamentally different people. I mean, and people with different temperaments can make the firmest of friends.
We also said it as well, it comments on fame, like what it does to people, and the first act is them, they're almost happy. They are happier at the start when they are chasing their dream, and then how fame splits them, divides them, or like you say, tests them.
And the pursuit of fame, rather, I think.
Yeah, not the end goal, but the journey.
Because they are pretty inept at some levels.
You're right to talk about that, and in fact, the more we discuss it and pick it apart, I think this is why it works so well and kind of stands above a lot of the other things that I've seen the last few days, is there are so many strands buried in this. Because
lovely complexity.
Absolutely, it is talking about the effect of fame, but it's also got the impact on people of social media as well, because, they're flooded with comments from users, listeners who they feel like they start to get to know, like a certain usernames comes up, and there's a bit of a twist with that.
They've got podcast groupies, haven't they, essentially?
Yeah, indeed.
Another thread there, what you mentioned about the heckler, is the misogyny. Like two women can't hang out together without society assuming their sexuality. And I've seen, we've seen many pieces that are trying to be talk about women that actually do say a lot less than this, which that's one of many strands.
Oh, it's not about that per se.
No, it's not about it,
but it's a flavour, isn't it? Yes,
actually, I can get more out of this than other pieces. So
because the drama has made it live in a way. Yeah, I mean, it's not preachy at all. No, but it doesn't mean it's not complex.
Yeah,
I'd like to unpick a few of the things you were saying about that sort of complexity. But the point you're making, Josh, as well, just now, about the community associated with podcasts, for good or for ill, the heckler is not considered a good character in this, even though he's obviously a regular, and they've sort of grown resigned to the fact he often comments. But as they progress through the story, there's more and more feedback. And actually that can be overwhelming, as we all know. Social media is a bear pit, or it certainly can be a bear pit. It also has the unfortunate effect of inflating and exaggerating and ultimately warping situations and one's relation to that situation. So facing a crisis between two friends would be bad enough, but facing a crisis of two friends in the glare of some kind of publicity and people commenting and feeling the need to comment and feeling the right to comment, and those two are different things, is ultimately incredibly damaging. And so that's also a nice. We were talking, about the comments that this show makes, or at least the references this show makes to modern society. That's all written in there as well, I think. I'm merely amplifying what you've just said there for the purposes of social media, interestingly. But
well, yes, and it begins as online feedback, kind of exclusively, faceless feedback. They get it in their garage. They take a fairly light-hearted view, even of the abusive comments at the beginning.
They feed it into the podcast, because the first item on every episode, their podcast is more of an agenda. They come in and they say, right, our first thing is listener feedback, and there's a jingle, I think, and then they read out their emails.
And though that slightly takes on a newer form later in the piece, where they're at MurderCon, where all the fans of Murder go, and
Felicia Taylor is going to be making her book review speech or whatever.
That's right, but at the point that I'm referring to, everything's becoming undone.
Later on, sorry.
Yes, right at the end, and Kathy and Stella have to face there and then, in a live space, their subscribers, their listeners, and they have to, face up to some of the decisions that have been made.
It's almost like a press conference, isn't it, with questions from the media.
Exactly, and you feel the stress and the pressure they're put under when it's there as an immediate thing, rather than having the slight distance of social media, which isn't, as it seems, as is revealed to us, later on.
It's funny, it's before we were recording, we were talking about that difference between intention and then what the wheels often fall off things when they meet reality. And we're not going to name names, but there are shows here in Edinburgh where it's obviously delightful intention, which has been sort of cosseted and sort of incubated by a small group of people who think it's fabulous, then hits the buffers because it's exposed in real life, and actually it's not that good. No amount of sentimental attachment to a piece of nonsense is going to make that nonsense anything other than nonsense. No names, no pack drill. Although insert all names of all shows that you've ever seen that fill that category here. I'll give you about 10 minutes. But there is that element with a podcast, because there is oddly, a podcast being mostly an audio medium is... it does insulate you as well as expose you. It's a very odd thing. People will write to you, people will, particularly if you have a mechanism for that. But the moment you go into what I call real life still, where you meet people in a room, where you talk to people face to face, where people can see you breathing and worrying and stuttering and all the things you can edit out, is actually terrifying, and as it is for the characters, but also in real life. We've all been in that situation. In a world of social media, there will be people you know much better online than you ever do in person. So maybe you never meet them in person. You might invite them to your wedding and discover you hate them. I'm just saying. Once again, I'm not sure what I'm doing with that statement, except to say that there is that dichotomy of huge contact with large numbers of people, but they only know a bit of you, or a face of you, or an image of you, because we all project, and a podcast is merely a way of projecting more profoundly. But actually, it's harder to hide who you are if you're facing them over a table, said Thos, talking to the two Joshes over a table.
Well, that's it. But you're highlighting maybe another point that is subtly or not so subtly being made in the piece, which is that by the end, all the partially damaged, more intimate relationships are, as you say, resolved, restored. The two of them together, recalibrated, and then whatever has happened in each of their individual lives with their family members is made much better, because probably they appreciate the reality of those relationships, however up and down they might be, compared with the very different, less tangible relationships they have with the listeners.
There are different social rules for social media than there are in real life. You're quite right, and you cannot transfer directly from one to the other, although they obviously feed into each other. So you're right, I think that's absolutely true. But and by their self-discovery and mutual discovery throughout the journey of the story, as you're saying, yes, they learn to separate perhaps what might be called reality against a heightened reality, or a designed reality of virtue. Yeah. Hey, that's a good phrase. I think you should copyright that. That might catch on.
Something as well. Because I'm wondering what's been added, because you said you saw a shorter version last year. I'm wondering if it's the American character. I can't remember her name now. The pod,
the one they all aspire to be.
Yes,
Felicia Taylor, isn't she?
Right, yes. I wonder if that is what they've added, because I feel like the show's also saying about sort of like production and corporate.
Or do you mean the agent?
Yeah,
because their small podcast becomes incorporated into a kind of conglomerate, which has multiple podcasts in that genre, and they get signed for a short period of time by this agent.
Yeah, I was like, what is it saying about? Because there's a very pointed moment where their microphone, at the start they get two microphones, and it's much glossier because they've showing that evolution in their podcast, or in their show. And I wonder what the show is saying about
artistic autonomy,
or production value, and
and late capitalism. The relationship between creativity and late capitalism is an infinitely fascinating one, and has been addressed on in a number of shows here in Edinburgh this year.
Okay.
So I agree with you entirely. That's quite interesting. Yeah, it's almost interesting. It is interesting to me that the aspiration of their podcast is to be picked up, to sort of stop being independent, which is such an Musical Talk is the independent musical theatre podcast. And no one's interested. So, but it would be a very interesting thing to me if it's never going to happen, and I'm not sure I'd want it to happen, but I've never aspired for Musical Talk to be sort of picked up. I like the way we bumble along fully independently, and I'm not sure why I would want that. But I fully understand if you get picked up, then the infrastructure is designed for you in some sense in terms of publicity and outreach, and therefore potential for making money, if that's one of the things that drive you, but certainly fame, which is one thing that does drive, to a degree, Kathy and Stella, but in slightly different levels of, they're both interested, but one's very interested, and I put the emphasis in that deep voice there, to really drive that home. But then late capitalism can spit you out again, and often does.
I think that coincides with, like I said, that they are happier at the beginning. They are happier when it's their small non-profit, and once they get into the machine, they're never satisfied.
No, they're not, are they?
Yeah, because they get to a level, but they're always looking up at the next. You know, like saying it's the definition of capitalism in a way. They're always looking to the next and the next and the next, and they're sort of just spinning in a wheel.
That idea of always searching for some better nirvana and then ultimately failing in the search because the search itself is fruitless. You know, you've failed in your journey to find nirvana if finding nirvana is what you want to do almost. In an episode of Frasier, the sitcom from the 1990s, where he and his brother Niles are constantly trying to improve their lot and social status, and they manage to get into a very exclusive sort of kind of club. But there's always these extra levels which you know there's closed doors to them, so they spend all their time trying to get to the next level of exclusivity, and ultimately they're in this kind of sauna area, so they're all wrapped in sort of cream and bandages and whatever it is, and they see this other door which appears to them to be the final door to what it is, and they sort of sneak through it, only to discover it's the fire escape, and they're in the back alley of the street, and they can't get back in because it's closed. And you think, well, there you are. I mean, it was fairly blunt, but it's a very funny episode and has stayed with me. So it is that kind of, you know, it's the grass is always greener, ultimately, if you want to boil it down to a more old-fashioned homily.
I'm sure Bronte Barbie's character at one point acknowledges that she says something to the other one, like, you know, the phrase "grass is green." I'm sure that's. I don't know if I'm making that up, but I'm sure that she says something in their heated argument about like that. You know, you're chasing, and you know, and because she's obviously thinking about university. I'm sure that comes up.
Well, it's let's go all the way to Betty Davis. You know, don't ask for the stars, we already have the moon. I think it is, or it might be the other way around. But you know, it's. She is of the two characters the one whose feet are closer to the ground anyway. I think, you know, she is the more grounded character, and that is the flip side to her friend, who is in the other direction. And actually, it's their balance, isn't it, that makes them who they are.
Well, I agree with all of that. I'm just sitting here thinking I need to do the endorsement of it, really, because there's so many things up here, and I'm pretty confident this is going to have much more of a life.
Oh yes,
beyond Edinburgh.
And it deserves it.
Absolutely. I think this is probably the best musical I've seen up here for 5-6 years, and in fact I would have been quite happy to have gone back there and seen it the very next day. This has been the one out of all the things the last few days that's really stuck with me. And
it's a standout show.
And speaking about it now, you think, oh, let's just go. It's on this afternoon. It is fantastic.
Now, obviously, when you come up to Edinburgh, you see more than musicals. You're a broad-minded pair of theatrically minded people, and I also go and see other things. But you have seen another musical with from the people behind Six, certainly has a great overlap, with a title which I think draws people in. You know, there's often actually something to be said from having a jolly good title. It doesn't always work, because if you don't understand the reference. Would you care to mention the show? And then I'll just briefly explain why I misunderstood it.
Okay, well, that's intriguing. So the show is Hello Kitty Must Die.
Now, this is the curse of not everyone using punctuation correctly. Because I am aware of the concept of Hello Kitty, but it doesn't live very firmly at the front of my mind because I'm not sure I'm the main demographic. And so when I saw this on paper, or rather I should say online, when I was looking through the lists of shows, I saw Hello Kitty Must Die.
I made that as we sat down. I turned to Josh and said, "Hello Kitty Must Die."
Well, you're quite right, because that is an interpretation, and if you don't know Hello Kitty, that is probably the way you're going to make that sentence make any kind of sense. So I assumed when I saw the title that this was going to be one of those Kind Hearts and Coronets kind of shows, whereby someone is going to kill somebody, possibly by being their friend, you know, lure them into a number of traps which all backfire. That was my immediate, and I'm guessing the show isn't that. I quite quickly realised that Hello Kitty was a thing, because I remembered it, but even now I couldn't absolutely say what Hello Kitty is. I know it's a kind of sort of Japanese motif, kind of character, I think, and it represents something, and presumably that is the thing that is found to be offensive. But I haven't seen the show, so I'm extrapolating quite a lot from a title which I misunderstood, and then reading the text, which made me realise that I was completely wrong. You've seen the show.
Yes, and perhaps the writers do acknowledge exactly what you've just said, because the first 5 minutes, first couple of numbers and spoken word is about explaining what Hello Kitty is.
Hello to Hello Kitty.
Yes, absolutely. And you've got 5 performers, all Asian as well, because, yes, you're quite right, is this East Asian idea is how it's presented in the show.
It's a concept, actually.
Well, it's Not originally.
Oh.
It started off as product or
It's hard to explain.
it was
isn't
a
it?
brand.
It's a brand, but Hello Kitty in the play is a symbol of
Yes.
Asian culture, and how it arrives on our shores as this sort of like packet, how we interpret their culture.
It is about the male perception of East Asian women.
In America.
In America, yes,
Particularly
it was where
women.
we're set. And so the main characters, it's an explicitly feminist message against the male gaze, but
GAZE.
yeah,
Thank
indeed,
you.
yeah.
Otherwise, that would be a very different show.
That's it. But a very specific version of the male gaze where we're looking just at East Asian women, and they apply the term Hello Kitty to represent the view that East Asian women seen through the lens of the white man should be quiet, cute, demure,
Oh, I see. It's like
passive.
Docile.
Yes.
It's like defining
domesticated.
a whole section. Geisha girls used to have the same kind of concept.
Right.
You know, maybe people don't talk about geisha girls in quite the same way anymore, and I can't pretend to be an expert, but I remember a time, and you see, I think there's a Bond film, isn't there, where there are some geisha girls. I'm not saying the Bond film is doing this particularly, but I don't remember the Bond film enough to be able to comment on it. But there was a sense that, yes, you're right, that too westernised, let's use this broadly, all Japanese women were thought to be like geisha girls.
Yes.
Even though geisha girls are a very particular thing.
That's it.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
in fact here...
It's cultural ignorance, isn't it?
Cultural ignorance, and we're actually talking about first, second generation Chinese women in America here. And the Hello Kitty kind of idea goes even further. Rather than just being passive and quiet, it's also a sexualised view
right.
of these women. And so the title Hello Kitty Must Die is these women saying this view of us in this way needs to be broken. We are independent, we're individuals. You know, it's going back to that idea.
Sorry, I'm suddenly reminded of something, a Cole Porter song, where this is sort of referenced. Now, Cole Porter was writing well before Hello Kitty became a brand, presumably. I mean, but there's a cut song from Kiss Me Kate, late 40s, I think, which is called It Ain't Etiquette. It was replaced by Brush Up Your Shakespeare, so it's something by the two very strange gangsters who turn up in Kiss Me Kate, who aren't that frightening. But they originally sang a song called It Ain't Etiquette, and it was a song about these sort of two Bowery boys who sang with that accent, talking about the finer points of society, and that in itself is quite funny. They're basically talking about how to behave in accordance with a book of etiquette by Emily Post, I think her name was. And one of the lines is, and interestingly, because this doesn't have cultural resonance in Britain, I've never really understood it. I understood what was being aimed at, but it's not a universal position, so it may be an American cultural one. But it's a series of Cole Porter couplets and three-line rhymes, and it's all terribly funny. But there's one where they say, if you're presented to the Chinese ambassador at a huge presidential event, don't go up to him and say, is it true about Chinese girls? Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. And that's late 40s. But isn't that interesting that that there's obviously an American cultural thing about presumably the sexual licentiousness of Chinese women, which is presumably being picked up here, but to me doesn't mean anything. I don't think that's a cultural thing here.
And in fact, it's not even licentiousness. Actually, it's more almost presented as like a challenge to be conquered by men, and that once you're with them, they become like a man's possession and a sexual object at that point.
Conquer is the word then, isn't it? Funny
Yes.
enough, this is reflected with Kathy and Stella to a degree, isn't it? There is a certain... we were talking about the heckler character, constantly calling them dykes and lesbians in a derogatory way, but there's always that sense, and I can't remember exactly if it's one of his comments, but it's a sense that, only sex with a man can, speech marks, cure them. You've seen that trope. So
Well, and it's multi-layered as well, because you've got that outside Western white, which they do explicitly talk about, gaze on the women, but you've also got the stereotypical Chinese father figure, and also mother, but the father is slightly more predominant, and how the young Chinese girls in American society, still in Chinese families, feel very constrained, and
it's a strong patriarchy within the family environment.
absolutely, and even to the extent of still looking at essentially arranged marriages, and
she calls her virginity like her family's pride or something like that.
It's almost like a dowry.
Yeah, they're interlinked, and the story kind of starts with her wanting to break out of that constraint, and she says, I won't say it, but she acknowledges.
Does she forthrightly make an expression?
Yes. She talks about her family pride and how she can, how can she ruin it.
But then again, there are going to be parallels here with Kathy and Stella, then, aren't there? There are, because they are in Kathy and Stella. We've spoken about already. People lay their assumptions upon them, and then they have to fight to be who they are within those constraints which have been applied. And in that sense, it sounds very similar to Hello, Kitty Must Die, or as it's not called, Hello, Kitty Must Die.
There is definitely elements of that. Probably the slightly tighter link would be with 6, and we've got the writers are involved with this as well, so there's the shared interest between those shows of women who don't have the freedom to express their own voice finding it in the space of the show. In fact, it's a very similar idea, isn't it, with Henry VIII's wives, whose stories we don't hear in history particularly in their own terms, and we get that in 6, reimagined of course, but then we also get that essentially from a different demographic, but still a underrepresented female voice coming out.
Now, I think this because you told me before we were recording that Hello, Kitty Must Die is actually originated as a novel. No, I'm guessing none of us have actually read that novel.
No.
I must say I've never heard of it, but adaptation is always quite a difficult thing, or it can often be a difficult thing. It can be terribly freeing because you can actually spin off in different directions and take different focuses from what the book is about, and sometimes that's marvellous. I actually think that the film version of The Remains of the Day is actually superior to the book, in my opinion. Please don't write in if you disagree, because actually I think it focuses on slightly different things. To me, it seems to be much more about character and reserve and the danger of that than actual, the difficulties arising from appeasement in the build-up to the Second World War. I know they're in flux, and you can draw whatever balance you want from that, but not all adaptations are able to fully fly free independently of their novel. Now, none of us have read that novel, but I suppose the question is, could you detect the novel lurking in the background of this show? Did you, as far as you were able to tell, watching it purely as a piece of theatre?
I think lurking is the word, because it's...
Yeah, thank you.
It's almost... not the elephant in the room, that's the wrong phrase, but it kind of feels like an obstacle almost. Like they can't... Well, because we haven't read it, we can only make assumptions, but yeah, it feels like there are parts where it's trying to stay so true to the book that it can't.
Oh, it's a faithful adaptation.
Well,
it may be.
Presumably, but you feel like it's just weighed, like the narrative, the plot that it follows. It just feels like
there's again, like it's a madcap plot. There are events which you sit there and look at and think this is stretching the bounds of credibility.
Which can be difficult if you're making a point.
Exactly, and I think that's maybe where the disjointed nature perhaps comes in, because I, again, speaking that I haven't read the novel, can quite easily see how all these very exciting elements of plot would make for an exciting read, and I can see why certain events would be there. I would presume that the novel doesn't begin in as forthright and strident a fashion as the musical, by foregrounding the message of wanting to break the image of the demure Chinese woman. And so because we do get that in the musical, we are now reading the piece through the lens of feminist politics, and therefore when that, to my mind at least, gets a little bit lost on stage in the madness of what's happening, that then as a piece of theatre starts to feel a little less coherent than you're expecting it to be, with such a strong message at the beginning. In the novel, I would be surprised if it begins like that, and I think that's maybe where the adaptation on this what I presume first iteration of the theatrical adaptation doesn't quite work. We mentioned with Kathy and Stella that you saw it last year. It's had a year of development, and we come to a really great piece now. It feels as though this is maybe the first draft, and
may come back in
could be
different
refined.
ways.
Yeah.
So it is possibly that sense, isn't it? Funny enough, what I was saying about Remains of a Day, where a focus has been put on the text available, which then can actually misfocus the message, if there is one.
I must actually jump in because I've just remembered, and to be absolutely fair, Kathy and Stella was extended this year. I do understand that Hello Kitty Must Die is a longer piece than what we had, and that it has been slightly condensed for the Fringe. So that
could affect coherence.
Because we're talking about coherence, that may well be significant.
And that's a very fair point. I mean, I've not seen it. And I think we also need to recognise that we are three white men talking about this particular show. And I suspect we don't have necessarily all the cultural tools as well to be able to talk about some of the elements. But that doesn't invalidate our voices per se, particularly just talking about it as we are. But we recognise that, so we draw that. But
I in fact, on that point, I think our impression was that we were up for the message.
Well, you went.
Well, indeed. But it's when that got, again to my mind, got lost.
It weakened.
Right, yeah.
There is. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when people talk about drama, they think about incident. Lazily, but that's what they think about. And actually, it is how do you focus what you've got. A book is a well-written book, and I don't need to tell you this, should be or can be multi-layered with lots of different things. And you, the reader, are the person who adapts it into the story that you want it to be in your head. So it may have messages, it may have incident, it will have lots of other things, subplots and blah blah blah. But you will decide what's most important to you and what you remember and how you judge it to be successful. Any adaptation has someone who does that for you. You're one step removed from the original text because somebody or some people have adapted it in a particular way and therefore had to put their own particular position on it. And so we've got that situation whereby you could easily say, well, the dramatic incidents of the book are going to be the structure of the dramatic incidents of the piece, but you can lose a message in that way. And I'm sort of picking up from you both that there's a slight, well, you said it yourself, it's got two different things going on and they don't necessarily mesh. You've got the incidents, and without breaking anything, I think you mentioned off the record that there's a murder plays a part in this, not unlike Kathy and Stella. And it's interesting, murder is a big dramatic incident, as we all know, but should it always be used dramatically? And I tell you why. I'm thinking like this. There was a show I chose not to see this year, which a few years ago I did go to. I went to see another version of it. Someone has again turned Jack the Ripper into a musical. Now, a few years ago I had fewer scruples, I think, or I wasn't as sensitive. You judge me whichever way you wish. But I went to see. I've seen various Jack the Ripper musicals. It's because it is a period of history in which I'm interested, and of course it tells you a great deal about the social context of the time. He said, justifying himself probably very badly. But now, this year, I thought, I'm now starting to reach that stage where the world is moving on. We recognise that the victims are more than victims. They are 5 or more individuals in their own right whose lives were cut short. They have stories themselves, and that is very rarely the story told. I did see, in fairness, one Jack the Ripper musical where they tried to flesh out the characters of the unfortunate people who were murdered, but not sufficiently well. And they focused on one rather than the others. And I don't know, it may be that the new one is doing that as well. But I didn't feel that it now feels tasteless. Now, obviously, they're real-life murders, and that does make a difference. I'm not saying let's not read about murders. I love detective fiction from the 1930s, but as we all know, they're sort of intricate puzzles which are, and you set, and they're not normally emotional either, so it becomes a puzzle and you're pitted against the detective or whatever. If murder is being used for dramatic purposes, it has to, in my opinion, earn its right to do so. It shouldn't just be used for shock value. I'm not saying that's what's going on here, but it can have that effect, particularly if there's multiple murders.
I think it is being used for effect because it feels extreme in this piece. Like I say, it is stretching the limits of what you would believe an actual situation would be, which I think when you are trying to make a point about the real world and about a real group of people, doesn't quite match up. And you know, there's another element where, like you were talking about Jack the Ripper's victims not having their voice. Well, you've got a whole string of unseen murder victims in this piece, all of whom are young women, none of whom have any voice at all, which seems to slightly rub against the feminist messaging of...
It's a question of taste and a question of messaging. Yeah.
To double down on what you said there, the show kind of exists in this uncanny valley where, you know, if you're trying to make a point about the real world, you either set it in the real world or you
fully absurdist.
You go into some allegorical space where it clearly is our world, and this kind of sits in between. Like it is our world, but characters do strange, absurd things, and it's uncomfortable.
Yeah,
you know, you either have to stay here or go over there, and it kind of
it's got a foot in both camps, and therefore. Doesn't quite straddle it, actually.
And it doesn't use the space or lighting to establish.
Okay, well, here's another point about that kind of thing. Then this is straddling different worlds, because we've picked up on the link to Six, and for people who know that show, you know, it's a pretty non-conventional piece of musical theatre, isn't it? It's a rock
it's essentially
opera
a
concert, really.
But it's actually aiming to be a rock concert.
Indeed.
You know, that is the context in which we see the show.
Right, okay, so I'm just going to get more into the nuts and bolts of the actual piece here, because we haven't spoken about the music really at all, and it feels to me as though if you were to listen to the whole soundtrack, it is a lot of chest range, belt style songs, kind of concert songs. You get a lot of the five performers in formation, strong, singing straight out to the audience, which you could just set on a pop stage, which for me doesn't quite match up with them trying to put it also into a narrative in a more conventional storytelling way. And so you know, I think that style of almost strident, confessional, personal experience song works really well for me personally in Six, because it is this strong message from someone who suffered, and I'm going to tell you. Well,
and is oddly also free of narrative requirement, oddly.
Exactly.
I mean, the thing about Six is there isn't much plot. So
there's not much plot, whereas in this there is an awful lot of plot. My immediate reflection was that there wasn't a lot of light and shade musically. It's all very similar and at a similar level of intensity for me. So
yeah, it's one of those things, as someone that isn't musically, that's not my specific background. As soon as you mention it, you do then you notice it, and then you can't unsee it. That the songs are very similar.
But you agree?
Yes, totally. Yeah.
That's I mean, because I haven't seen it, so I can't comment. But it is very interesting that somewhere in this, I mean, before we started, you said it was a terribly accomplished show. You know, it looked great.
The five performers, vocally, the performance was superb. Really, genuinely, very, very good. They didn't write the show.
Fine, and I mean, you know, that ultimately is where this goes, I think, isn't it? So this is a beautifully produced show, a beautifully sung show, terribly professional, but we're saying that actually there's a little bit of a breakdown in the balance between plot and message, which is actually proving quite difficult to straddle, we think.
I think so at the moment, and you know, when the performance finished, I like to just open my ears and listen to the people around me, and that did seem to be the general consensus.
Well, that is actually a very interesting, you know, what does the other person think?
Yeah, and I've been reading different reviews of things just to get a broader spread of what the opinions are, and it seems to be very similar. I mean, the stars are stars, aren't they? Everyone has a slightly different interpretation, but the consistent thread running through all of it is that there is definitely a worthwhile message, musically and vocally decent, but just isn't quite finished yet.
Yeah, hone that text.
Yeah. Well, and that's what, you know, it has got the original text. They've got something to go back to, and you know, maybe get enough another set of eyes on it and see what...
It could be dramaturged a bit, perhaps.
Yeah,
that was exactly what I said.
Yes.
And again, I must keep going back because I don't want to come across unfairly. I probably do need to see the full extended version because that
yes, of course,
may well have.
Yeah. And I'm intrigued to read the book now, just see what was what is the original.
So there's an interest. I mean, that's a really positive thing here. But actually, we are sufficiently interested in what's going on here to hope there's.
And I think
to be interested in the wider world of this particular concept.
And like you say, like we chose to go there. When I read the preview or the blurb, you do think I genuinely don't know enough about this, and you want to go. And I think more of the fact that I've come away and I still feel I need to go and read the book maybe says
it's both a positive and a negative then in that
yes.
sense, isn't it? But this is absolutely fascinating. That a show can touch all these things.
Mm. And I said to Josh, I'm glad we saw it for that reason, that we get to have this discussion post, and that we're still contemplating it and thinking.
You haven't dismissed it. That's the point.
Yes,
you're still carrying around in your head and dramaturging it yourselves almost.
Another, I know we're starting to wind up the conversation, but another parallel that I've heard and read from a few quarters was with Heathers. And
which is a popular musical.
It's popular, and that was another kind of vibe I picked up in the auditorium. There's definitely the component. You could see it becoming a cult favourite again, and people knowing all the songs. But the reviews of Heathers are, I think, similarly spread.
Let's just be honest about Heathers. You either love it or you hate it. Appears to be the general response.
But it's for very similar reasons. It's about the plot, which actually goes in not dissimilar directions, which is similarly incredible in terms of what happens, but musically interesting to a lot of people and performed very well and all that sort of thing.
Well, it is interesting. I mean, almost every show has somebody who has there's going to have an adherent, someone who's going to love it, even when you just think, well, I can't see. I mean, not saying that's the case here, but I've been to shows when I think that's a pile of old nonsense, and out you come and you hear people saying, well, I like that. Or conversely, I was in a show I really liked the other day, but there was, I thought, a comic scene about, I have to say, a man leaving his wife and baby. Because it was an absurdist plot. So, but I came out and I heard two people on the stairs behind me deeply offended by that scene.
Well, yeah.
Although it's an absolute common part of all 20th century and 21st century drama, surely.
Yeah, and that's all we do here when we talk about the shows together, isn't it? We try to put a bit more flesh on our own personal opinions, really.
Yes, well, we are a bundle of our own cultural references. Mm-hmm. Well, Josh and Josh, Joshes, plural. Is it Josh I don't know.
We have this discussion.
Joshopodes, if you want to take the Greek plural.
Latin.
We'll leave it.
Josh eyes. Seriously, though, I thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me today about these two very different and yet somehow overlapping shows. There are sort of resonances between one and the other. And it's also a great pleasure to see you here in Edinburgh, and to know that there are still these great shows that you can talk about in all these different directions and with senses and flavours. So I look forward to talking to you, Josh C, again very soon. Josh B, I don't think we're likely to meet too often, but if I do, it will be a pleasure, and it's been wonderful hearing you. But together, thank you so much for sharing our experiences. We've actually brought these things alive, because I haven't yet seen these shows. One I'm probably not going to see, and one I shall. So when I have, I'll tell you if you're right.
Yes, pleasure as always.
I shall judge furiously.
Thank you, Thos.
Musical talk. Well, there we are. Josh Beavis and Josh Clark talking about Hello Kitty Must Die and Cathy and Stella Solve a Murder. And it was interesting to me to be able to talk about a show, the first one, Cathy and Stella Solve a Murder, which I'd only seen last year in its original version. As I said at the beginning of this episode, I then went on to see it in its newly expanded version, and it's better than ever. If, as I hope, it does go on some kind of national tour, do keep an eye out for it. It's a show that's absolutely well worth seeing. And as for Hello Kitty Must Die, I think we're all waiting to see how that develops into the future. It has a promising pedigree. It'll be interesting to see if it can capitalise on that, and perhaps iron out one or two of the kinks in what sounds like a slight disconnect in one or two of the areas that it's trying to bring together in a musical form. Well, that's it for this episode of Musical Talk. We've reviewed 2 shows in some depth, and in the next few weeks I'll be talking about more shows that we saw in Edinburgh. And then after that, we'll start to hear the longer interviews and a selection of songs from the shows which could have been seen at this year's wonderful Edinburgh Festival Fringe. It's one that's bound to live long in the memory, and I hope here on Musical Talk we can share those memories with you, whether or not you were able to attend this year. But that, I think, brings this episode of Musical Talk to an end. I do hope that you'll be able to join me next time, or whenever. But until then, it's time for me to say goodbye. I think in about 3 seconds. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, presented by Josh Clark, Thos Ribbits and Josh Beavis, and edited and produced by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2023. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. Would you both care to give me a very quick level? Obviously, it's a little bit rough and ready here. Yes. The usual thing is, what did you have for breakfast?
Absolutely nothing so far. The owner of the bed and breakfast furnishes me with hard-boiled eggs, and alas, I had to leave. So nothing for me so far.
That's a very poetic opening, by the way. He furnishes me with boiled eggs, but alas, I had to leave.
Yeah.
I could start a poem that way.
Absolutely. I'm here to inspire.